Well, good morning and good afternoon to everyone who's joining us today. We are very honoured to have two guest speakers, Robyn and Krista de Castella, who are Soto Zen priests in Shunryu Suzuki Roshi's lineage. They are from Canberra, Australia, but they first encountered Zen in Japan when they were living there from 2007 to 2009, and they have spent the last decade practicing and training through San Francisco Zen Centre at both the city centre there and at Tassajara Zen Mountain Monastery. And they will be returning there in the next week or two to take up the joint position of Ino, which is head of the meditation hall for the fall practice period. And we are very honoured to have you come and share with us a little of what it's like to live in a Zen monastery. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you Neddy for the introduction and for the invitation to be here. It's wonderful to be here at Twining Vines. Krista and I have, as Neddy mentioned, have lived in abroad quite a bit and practiced a bit in Japan and quite a bit in the US, and always lamented that we kind of had to do so to find the practice that we found, because we're originally from Canberra. But so to have a place of practice in the tradition that we love and the one that we are ordained in is very it's wonderful. And to be in Australia, to be here is somewhat unexpected. We came back from the US expecting to have a kind of short trip, and the visa gods thought otherwise, so we found ourselves here longer, and so I do apologize for we did not pack our full priest garb, and so apologies for that. But we as Neddy mentioned, we're going to be heading back to Tassajara pretty soon. Before I forget, I just want to say hello to everyone who's tuning in on the screen there. It's great to see you all, and so we'll be heading back to the US, to California, to be back at Tassajara, just as the weather here in Canberra is starting to warm up and the trees are starting to bud. We'll be leaving and going back to the US, where the leaves will be starting to fall and the weather will be starting to get colder. So we're very sad to be missing spring here. And we'll be heading back to a practice period that will be happening at Tassajara. And perhaps you know about what a practice period or ango is, but it's a period, typically it's about 90 days. It harks back to, I think, when Buddhism was in India, and the monsoonal months meant that people tried to really spend that time when it was too wet to do much else, to really double down on practice and sitting, and in a lot of ways that sentiment has remained, and so we'll be returning to spend 90 days with I think it's about 40 or so people who'll be joining us at Tassajara and being part of this beautiful choreographed dance that is the practice period at Tassajara, where there are so many different everyone's filling their role, and every practice period the roles seem to change somewhat, and from the Shuso to Benji to the Tanto and the Ino and the Shika and the list of these various roles goes on, and we all play our part. And it's a sort of beautiful choreographed dance. So yeah, I guess I thought it would be helpful perhaps to give a little bit of an overview of Tassajara, and then Krista's going to talk a bit about what a daily life looks like during a practice period at Tassajara, and then maybe we'll try to wrap up with a little bit of, for us, what we've why we're returning and why we would go and do something like practice at a place like Tassajara. And perhaps this is a good time to give a disclaimer that the things that we might say are really just our own stories, and there are so many. For every person who's been to a place like Tassajara, they have a very different experience, sometimes similar perhaps, but so really we can only speak for our own experience. So the San Francisco Zen Centre, of which Twining Vines is an affiliate sangha. There are sanghas all over the world and the US, but the San Francisco Zen Centre has three main temples in California that I guess were there founded at the beginning by Suzuki Roshi. We've spent a good deal of time at City Center, which is a temple that's kind of nestled in the center of San Francisco and is very much about a life of integrated practice where people who live at the temple might also have a job outside, and so it's this sort of beautiful blend of temple and lay life, and sitting in the zendo, we sit to the sounds of honking car horns, and sometimes if you're lucky you might overhear a conversation that two people are having on the corner, and totally unaware that there are 40 or 50 people sitting silently, able to hear them perfectly in the zendo right there. And the name that's given to City Center is Hoshinji, which translates as beginner's mind. It's sort of a great gateway and a way for those who, but a lot of people find Zen through coming to a talk perhaps that is given on the weekend or what have you. There's the second temple that I won't really talk about very much is Green Gulch Farm Zen Center, which is just about an hour north of San Francisco, and that's beautifully nestled in amongst redwoods, and kind of has, I think, a middle path, if you like, where it's a little bit more isolated but still has some opportunity for people from the city to visit on the weekends and that kind of thing. And then Tassajara is its traditional its name is Zen Shinji, which you could translate to Zen Mind Temple or Zen Heart Temple, and it is about 4 hours south of San Francisco, sort of inland from the coast, in the Ventana Wilderness, and it's particularly remote. I think that's certainly one of its defining characteristics. Is it's incredibly remote, and it's the way in which life there is integrated into nature is, I think, part of its charm. So I said it's about 4 hours. The last hour of the drive is along a rocky dirt road that weaves through the mountains. And usually we would have to take a four-wheel drive in order to ride that road, and it's, some people talk about it being the true gate of Tassajara, the road, and that sounds right to me as well. That it's a way in which it's sort of, you don't get too many visitors during practice period because it's such a it's such a long way to come, and there's also a feeling of being very much cloistered in, and you know, you're there, and you certainly don't have a feeling of isolation when you're there, if you're or at least I don't in during practice period, because you're doing this thing with other people, but the wider world, the comings and goings that happen in the world seem somewhat remote, and I think that's part of its charm, and that's, I think, very much a quality that I think many monasteries try to have. So yeah, as I said, you come down this road, and you pass through. Oh, and by the way, there are we brought some photos. I apologize to the people online. You probably won't be able to see this, but maybe we can send you a link to an online album. But we thought it might be helpful as much as I can make an effort to describe what it's like. Maybe photos are easier. But you come down this road, and you pass through forests, and you'll madrone trees and manzanita trees, and then through almost a arid desert-like landscape with yucca plants and cacti, and then you'll come into this. At the very end, you'll descend into this valley where suddenly the terrain becomes a lot more lush, and there are very mature maple trees and sycamores and oaks, and usually the first thing, well, maybe not the first thing, but the ever-present sound is the sound of the creek, or it's just, depending on what the rain's been doing, it will be trickling, or it can be, a raging torrent. But it runs. Tassajara Creek runs through I guess you'd call it the western border of Tassajara, and it's this ever-present sound, and the smell is it's kind of distinct. It's sort of a bit sulfury, because the Tassajara is there are hot springs there, and so that smell is, anytime I smell the sort of sulfury hot spring smell, I'm taken back to Tassajara, and you kind of get used to it pretty quickly. But it's a place, I think, that has been a place people have been coming for a very long time because of these hot springs, and so for thousands of years, the Native American Esselen people were visiting this area, and then the Western folk, I think, came to it in the 1800s, and much later it became a place that Suzuki Roshi was able to found Tassajara in the late 60s, and because of that, it's the oldest, I believe, monastery in the West, or at least in the US. And the hot springs are kind of a way in which they kind of give life to the place, because it's so cold in the winter. It doesn't snow continuously. It has snowed when we've been there at times, but it's a place where the monks will bathe, and also it provides heat to a lot of the, not a lot, some of the cabins and buildings there, and it makes things workable, I suppose, and I think that's maybe all I'll say. I think, Krista, you might want to talk a bit about. I'll hand it off to you. You can talk a bit about daily life there.
Sure. Before I maybe jump into some of what a day looks like in practice period, it might be helpful to know that if you have the opportunity to come for a practice period as a new student, the first thing that you'll do is sit something called Tangario, which is an initiation period, and it harks back to this tradition in sort of ancient Japanese and Chinese monasteries of students having to really demonstrate their sincerity of intention and their aspiration to train as monks before being admitted into a temple or monastery. Maybe that would be outside the temple gates, or in a more modern way, when Robyn and I have spent some time in Japan, or we visited, we trained for a little while in a temple in Okinawa. Tangario consisted of sitting for an hour in seiza on tatami outside what I think we actually were allowed to sit inside the zendo, but traditionally you sort of undertake a little bit of a challenge with that, and they understand that most people that come are newer to sitting, so they're really looking to see if you have sort of this spirit of really wanting to take up this practice, even if it's a bit challenging or a little uncomfortable. At Tassajara, this initiation period runs for 5 days. So students who come into the valley will sort of be shown to their cabins. They'll have an afternoon to settle in, and then that evening they come and sit zazen in the zendo, and Tangario begins. And for the next 5 days, the request is that you just sit. So just sitting zazen, no talking, no bathing, no working, really just in there for every period. Meals are in the zendo with the community. And it's a very physically, emotionally, psychologically, it's a challenging experience. If you've ever had the opportunity to sit, a sesshin, a week-long retreat, or even just sitting kind of a longer period of zazen, I'm sure you know that unless, maybe for very flexible, adept people, it might not be so hard, but certainly for me, it was a challenging experience. And I remember being quite humbled by it, as I've always been a very serious martial artist and considered myself to have quite a good pain threshold, but it's surprising how uncomfortable it can be just sitting still and not doing anything for an extended period. And I have memories of sitting in the zendo and hearing the crunching of pebbles outside as people are walking around and raking and cleaning and working, and just this longing to be out there doing anything other than sort of this, what I've been asked to do with sitting in the zendo. And now, it's interesting, many years later, being on the other side, where now the people walking around the zendo and cleaning and working, I have sort of this appreciation for all that's happening in the temple to support students to come and sit. It's actually a very special experience to get to do that, even though it can be difficult. Most people, I think, will say that it's a valuable experience. And eventually Tangario ends, and there's a short ceremony to welcome the new monks into the temple, and also a ceremony that starts or really marks the beginning of this 3-month intensive of time, this 3-month period called the Ango. And for the duration of the practice period, a regular day usually sees us waking up at 3:50. So there's a wake-up bell at 3:50 a.m. and it's very dark. It's we spend the first several hours of every morning in the darkness, and then the evenings in the darkness. And I remember this sort of blurring of night and day. It's sometimes not even clear whether it's morning or evening, and maybe that's also compounded by the general tiredness that creeps in over time. But the valley is completely dark, and this wake up bell is run by a student called the Shuso. So the Shuso is the head student in the practice period, and traditionally each practice period is kind of an initiation period for one student to be taking the first steps into becoming a Zen teacher. And so they're in their own kind of training. And the Shuso is usually a very experienced long-term practitioner that is sort of seen as being ripe for becoming a teacher. And so it's quite a special position to be the Shuso in the practice period. And one of the things that I love about this tradition is that the other full-time job of the Shuso every day is to do the compost and clean all the toilets. So just in case the Shuso's feeling a little special in their position, they're brought thoroughly down to earth with this menial activity that they have to do. So the Shuso runs a wake-up bell through the valley, and they run it in quite an intricate pattern, kind of weaving through all these cabins and going through the dining room and the kitchen and all these different areas. They start at the Zendo and end at the Zendo, and so that we all wake up together. And then people slowly trickle to the Zendo, maybe via the coffee tea area to get a strong cup of coffee or a bowl of matcha. And the only way you can find your way to the Zendo is through all these little lights that will help mark the path, because it's quite dark. And when I first started a practice period at Tassajara, all these little lights were kerosene lanterns. And it was really something quite charming about that, actually. And it was one of the jobs of a person in the practice period, a job that would rotate. This person was called the Jikudo. And they had a variety of responsibilities, but one of them was to get up before the wake-up bell with this big cylinder circle container that they'd wear around their neck full of matches, and they'd have to travel the entire way around the valley and individually light every single one of these kerosene lamps, and then eventually there would later be someone that would be extinguishing them all. So anyway, so just a nice little digression, but so the Shuso runs the wake-up bell, and then over the course of a regular day we sit approximately 6 periods of zazen, so about 5 hours in the Zendo, and the schedule changes a little bit, not that much, but during sesshin, which is a week-long silent period of practice or retreat. We have 3 of these sesshins in a practice period. We'll sit a little bit more zazen, so we'll do roughly 11 periods of zazen, so about 8.5 hours in the Zendo. And each day, after zazen in the morning, we have a long period of morning service, so about 45 minutes of chanting, and this is where there's sort of instrumentation and a lot of bowing and incense offering. And if there are important ceremonies like sort of the Suzuki Roshi Memorial, which we practice once a month, or commemorating Dogen's birthday or Buddha's enlightenment, or some of these other very special, big, elaborate ceremonies, they'll often happen in morning service. And yeah, on an average day, we will chant a variety of English and Japanese sutras. Some of them are things we chant multiple times a day, and some are sutras, often writings of Dogen Zenji, one of the founders of our Zen tradition in Japan. These beautiful poetic pieces of writing. We'll sort of rotate through a variety of these texts and chant them together in the mornings. And the other thing that is interesting to note, in the same way we have doans here in the Zen group, someone responsible for the bells and the jiko for the incense. At Tassajara we have a small crew of people called the doan rio, usually about 5 or 6 people that will spend the entire practice period just training in these forms, playing the instruments and helping conduct the ceremonies or chanting and leading the chants. So it's quite a special thing to be able to really spend and give so much time to the study of this ritual and these forms, and at least something that we love. I think maybe it's unusual for Australians that are often very atheistic or kind of not so interested in religious practice, but we love all of the tradition and the ceremony and ritual, and so it's wonderful that there's so much time to train and practice that. And we'll be going back to Tassajara help support that aspect of practice as Inu. In addition, so we have this longer service in the morning. We have a short 10-minute service before our noon and our evening meals. So we spend about a little over an hour each day in service doing this chanting practice. And we have 3 meals a day, all in the zendo, with the exception of an occasional dining room breakfast or dinner, which is a bit more Western style, and usually something that's a bit more casual, and something done on a personal day. So we have, rather than having a set 5-day working week and a 2-day weekend at Tassajara, and I think this is traditional for most Japanese or Soto Zen monasteries. There's a 4-day working kind of practice schedule, and then 1 day off, which we call the personal day. And on your personal day, you get to sleep until 4:50. It's fantastic. A whole extra hour. It's amazing how relative things are. So we do all 3 of our meals in the zendo. And I'm not sure how familiar people may be with this practice called oryoki, but I'll try to explain it a little bit. So this is a Japanese monastic form for eating in the zendo that I believe evolved originally as a very efficient means of feeding a large group of people. So if you have 100 monks all eating together, and everyone's eating off plates and bowls with utensils, it's a lot of washing up to do after a meal. So oryoki happens at your seat. You have a set of bowls. Every student has a set of bowls, and they'll eat with the bowls and clean them at their seat and pack them up and leave the zendo exactly as you found it. So the only kind of cleaning or extra work that has to happen is taking care of the pots that are used for serving and cooking the meal. So it's a very practical form, but it's also a very, very important part of our forms and training, and there is a very ceremonial aspect to it and an incredible amount of detail in how we use our oryoki bowls and sets and utensils, how we lay everything out, the order that you do things and how you eat. And so it's this incredible art form, and when it's practiced together in a group, it becomes this sort of dance that Robyn was describing earlier, where in the zendo, at certain points, people will sort of bow in a wave formation that will flow around the zendo, and they'll lift their bowls up and it will flow around, and things are being synchronized with instrumentation or drumming or certain aspects of the meal, and we're all participating in this dance together. And maybe just to illustrate the amount of detail, if when we have an orientation session, or we have an oryoki review session for new students when they come to Tassajara, and these are people that have already practiced oryoki, so they're already familiar with the form, but we could easily spend over 2 hours like going over details in the meal, if even among experienced practitioners. So there's just, and then we spend the entire practice period usually making announcements at every work circle about corrections and things people need to pay attention to that they might be missing. So there's just a huge amount of detail, and but it's a really beautiful practice. And if it interests you, if you want to kind of know a little bit more about it, there's a wonderful series of videos that were put together by a teacher from Green Gulch Zen Centre called Linda Ruth. Linda Ruth Cutts, I should say her whole name, I'm sorry. And she's very experienced with these forms and loves them, and she put together a real treasure trove of explanatory and training videos that are on the San Francisco Zen Center website. We have our meals in the zendo, in addition to a zazen service, And then outside the Zendo, we will have some period for study each day. We have a independent study period that runs for about an hour in the mornings. And every other day there may be a Dharma talk or a class in the dining room for students. A Dharma talk usually in the Zendo, and that is at the discretion of the practice period leader. And the Shuso may also be giving their first Dharma talks during a practice period. And then we have a period of time each day reserved for work. So we will come together, usually first thing in the morning, and do 20 minutes of soji. This is after study, so we'll all chip in and do this temple cleaning activity where everybody's sent to different corners to do different things, maybe meal prep or cleaning or something else. And then later in the afternoon, we have a larger block of work that runs for about 3 hours. We have a work circle where we come together, and it's common during practice period for there to be a variety of different crews, so there may be a small crew of people responsible for the grounds and for gardening and tending to all of the plants and things, and a crew of people responsible for working in the shop, doing woodwork and maintenance and repair work and other things, and a crew of people in the kitchen preparing all of the meals for students. And there is also, for students that are newer, the Tangaryo monks, they'll be on something called general labour, or they'll be rotated through a variety of different jobs and work activities and get a feel for different things. And then after work at 4:15, we have bath and exercise time, which is the closest thing we have to free time in our day. And it's about an hour, and this is the time you can do the laundry, have a cup of tea, read a book, socialize, exercise, and bathe. And it goes very quickly. But that's maybe pretty self-explanatory. And maybe the last thing I would just say is that we have a practice of noble silence during practice period, where from the sound of the han, which is a particular instrument that calls us to the Zendo, when we hear that after the evening meal, all the way through until after lunch the next day, we are in silence together. And it's not in a really strict kind of rigid way. If you are working and you have a question, it's functional speech is fine, but we try to reserve chit chat and socializing and any unnecessary talking for the more appropriate time in the afternoon. And it's quite a wonderful and unusual thing to actually live in community living and practicing with so many people in silence together. There's actually a real intimacy that comes from that, and it's not uncommon a little bit into practice period to maybe be sitting in the Zendo and to hear someone walking and know exactly who that person is. So there's sort of this way we get to know each other very well through the silence, and so I think that's a wonderful practice, even though it's certainly been hard for some of us like me that are very chatty. So I think I'll pass over to you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Talk about what time we go to bed.
Oh, we go to bed at 9 o'clock. Fall into our beds and sleep whatever hours we can. So, yeah.
Yeah, so I think a question that we get asked a lot when we come back to Australia from family and friends is they're kind of curious about why we choose to live abroad and be in a place doing this, and they ask, well, what do you get out of it? And it's a difficult question because it feels like it would be a little bit flippant to say nothing, but it's the closest. I mean, really, it's difficult to answer. It's like why leave your home for the dusty realms of other lands? This is a question that's being asked in Zen quite a bit. And thinking about it, I think there are a few reasons that I could say for myself, and I suppose hopefully you would agree, on what would be, why we would, it would be, why we live at a place like that. I think the first is immersion. There's something a little bit special about being able to be practicing in a fairly tight container of a schedule, 24/7. So even days off have, a lot of things that need to be done. And so really it's, if you're trying to learn a language, the best way to do that, I think a lot of people would say, is to travel to the place where they speak that language and immerse yourself in it. And Tassajara really offers that in a way that it's difficult to in other places. I think we've certainly done our fair share of practice that has that one might do in the morning and then in the afternoon, and try and integrate that into a life of other things. And I think that's pretty normal way of practicing. But this is a way of deepening and to from the moment you wake up through till when you go to sleep, to be in a continuous place where there's some effort for practice, and that others are doing that too is very supportive. The second thing I would say is that there's a simplicity to life in this way, because I think it's very normal to have a life outside of a place like Tassajara that has many different hats one would wear. You might be a parent, you might have a particular role you have in your work, and life is complex. And in a monastic setting, things get stripped away, and that's helpful, I think, because when there's less time to be attending to paying the bills and trying to sit in traffic, and I don't know, I'm doing a bad job of making regular life sound difficult, but it is, I think. At least I find it to be challenging. It's very easy to have attention being pulled in many different ways, and being in a place where a lot of that's stripped away, for myself, has been helpful to observe how I still manage to get in the way of myself and catch myself, make life hard for myself, even in a place where all I need to really do is attend to what's immediately in front of me most of the time. So that is something I think that's unique about life there. And the way things are set up, everyone has a job to do, and that job is almost always in the service of the group and the whole. So we all carry a little bit of the load for each other, and so life becomes quite simple because you just do your job and it's right there. And then lastly, I would say that community is maybe the other thing that's very powerful about, in my experience at a place like Tassajara, the friendships, and the way in which practicing with others, I think, particularly from its time in Japan, I think Zen practice is really something we do together, and in doing it together, we see ourselves reflected in each other, and we support each other by showing up to the Zendo. And so, if I was helicoptered into a place like Tassajara where I was going to live by myself, it would be much harder to get up at 3:50. But to do that and know that I have a job where I need to be, lighting the altar and playing the bells, whatever it is, makes that somehow, it supports an intention and effort, and to have others doing that is really wonderful. And also just rubbing up against people too. It's not always. Sometimes it's a difficult place for people at times, because you're sleep deprived, perhaps. You might be dealing with resistances to something, and so to have that opportunity to be kind and to be patient with oneself and other people, and that metaphor of stones being polished by tumbling and rubbing together is, I feel, very apt for life in close quarters like that. You've got some ideas on that too, right?
I think that this idea of the sort of the friction and how we slowly wear away some of our sharper edges. I think it also applies to the practicing within the schedule there, or at least has for me, of rubbing up against the schedule. The other thing we haven't spoken much about is the shingi. So the shingi is a series of guidelines that speak to a decorum that is observed at Tassajara. So they might include things like needing to wear robes. We wear robes whenever we're in the zendo or at service. And needing to be clean and tidy, and not running and not shouting, and sitting down to eat and drink. All these things that help support an environment that is conducive to practice. So, and for a lot of people, all of these things can feel constrictive of personal freedom. The schedule, the shingi. There's a visual metaphor for this that I find helpful, and I've heard spoken about in some Zen talks, of a snake inside a bamboo tube, and the snake actually fits quite nicely in the bamboo tube. There's not really a problem there, but if you're squirming and wriggling and you want to move and you want to go in different directions, then you feel the constriction of that environment. And so I think that resonates for me, and there's been a practice for me of trying to find more ease within the environment that I find myself in at Tassajara and in practice period. And it also reminds me of a quote from Suzuki Roshi where he says, "You should enjoy your problems." I'm like, I'm definitely not quite there. I can aspire to that, right? And I at least think I understand a little of what he's getting at. And so I think over the years, seeing my mind squirming with I want more sleep, and I want less of that, and I want more time to do this and that. There's a way in which there's a subtle training that's happening that is helping me try to relax and find some okayness with things that are a little uncomfortable and difficult, and also learn about the way I make things a whole lot harder for myself with my resisting and my pushing against what is happening. So I think Zazen offers a version of that for me as well. Sitting with discomfort or boredom or sleepiness. I'm sure no one's experienced any of that, and having to find sort of this posture that's just opening to what's happening as it is, even if it's not what I choose. So the Zendo offers that for me, and then the schedule and the community practice, and I think that I guess it's my hope that I can bring that sort of training or that learning to bear on life outside the monastery, because I certainly can't control what exactly, what happens to me and what happens around me. And it would be nice, and I'm sure I'm in for difficulties, as like if I'm fortunate enough to live long enough, I will encounter difficulties. And so it would be nice to learn how to meet them with a little more ease and a little less resistance. So that's been an important part for me. And then I think the only other piece I'd elaborate on, I think Robyn's already spoken to well, is this collective element to practice at Tassajara. And we spent a little bit of time living in Japan, and it always strikes us actually this real cultural difference when we come back to more individualistic countries like the United States and Australia. There's a lot of teachings in Zen and in Buddhism more generally about interconnectedness. But for me, I think over the years, it sometimes felt like an intellectual exercise or something I might ponder occasionally, as I go about my life, focusing on my friends and my family and my work and, whatever it is. Where I think that at Tassajara, it's more apparent. Everybody is doing their part all the time. Everyone's role is important. We can't even have a meal actually without everybody doing their part in a meal. Certain things won't work, And so, what one does really matters, and it's felt when somebody is missing or someone makes a mistake. We all make mistakes, but we all feel it together. And so there's a way in which we're quite literally all in it together. And I think that's true outside the monastery, but maybe just more visible for me, at least, at Tassajara in practice period. So I don't know if we've gone a bit over.
We probably should finish there.
Okay, that's
Or
it.
we might lose too many people.
No, okay. Anyway, thank you so much. It's a pleasure getting to share a little bit of that with you all. If anyone has questions or they ever want to talk more about us, you're welcome to reach out to us via email. So I don't know, would you have anything you want to say to wrap up? Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much. We really appreciate it. And are you okay for us putting this up on our website? So
Yeah, sure.
Okay, wonderful. Well, let's just finish there. We'll finish with our closing chant, and then maybe you might need to move this, and I'll do the exit bows after the chant.
Okay.
Beings are numberless. I vow to save them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless. I vow to enter them. Buddha's way is unsurpassable. I vow to become it.